The morning light spilled across the fields of northern France like liquid gold, touching every blade of grass with warmth before the day began. In the small village of Saint-Denis-sur-Meuse, the air smelled of bread and wood smoke, and the sound of distant church bells drifted lazily through the mist. Children ran barefoot along the narrow dirt road, their laughter echoing between whitewashed cottages. Among them was a boy named Julien Morel, just 9 years old, with eyes the color of river water and curiosity that seemed too large for such a small place. He lived with his mother in a stone house at the edge of town, where chickens scratched in the yard and an old radio hummed quietly on the windowsill. Every morning before school, he would climb the hill behind their home to watch the trains pass. To Julien, the world beyond those iron tracks was a mystery. Paris, London, names he'd heard only in stories told by travelers at the bakery. The war felt distant then, like a rumor carried on the wind, too far away to touch him. That morning, as he sat on the hill, the sky glowed with the pale blue of peace. He could hear his mother calling from below, her voice carried by the wind. "Julien, breakfast." He smiled and ran back, his shoes kicking up dust. Inside, the table was simple, a pot of milk, a crust of bread, and the smell of apple jam cooling by the window. His mother hummed softly as she poured coffee, her hands worn but gentle. Julien watched her in silence, memorizing the rhythm of their mornings without knowing why. The sound of the spoon against the cup, the way sunlight broke through the curtains, the way peace sounded like nothing at all. Outside, a cart rolled by, and the village awoke, the blacksmith hammering, the baker lighting his oven, and the old mayor sweeping his doorstep. Life was slow, ordinary, and beautiful. It was the kind of peace that history rarely remembers, yet it's always this kind of peace, that wars destroy first. In the evenings, when the sky turned amber and the smell of burning hay drifted through the air, Julien and his friends would play near the churchyard. They built wooden swords, pretending to be knights defending their kingdom from invisible enemies. The grown-ups watched from their doorsteps, smiling. None of them imagined that within months, real soldiers would march down the same cobblestone road where their children played. Julien loved to chase fireflies. When dusk fell, his laughter lighting the darkness like sparks. Sometimes he would stop to listen to the silence that came before night, the whisper of the wind through wheat, the creak of shutters, the far-off whistle of a train. He didn't know it yet, but that silence would soon be broken by engines, boots, and gunfire. For now, though, the world still belonged to innocence, and the boy who dreamed on the hill believed it always would. It began with a sound that didn't belong. One morning, as the sun climbed over the river, Julien heard it, a low rumble, distant but steady, like thunder trapped beneath the earth. The villagers paused mid-task, turning toward the horizon. Dust rose on the far road, and soon after came the silhouettes of trucks, grey and heavy, their engines growling as they rolled closer. The German convoy entered Saint-Denis-sur-Meuse just before noon, sunlight glinting off their helmets like shards of glass. The laughter that had once filled, the streets vanished, swallowed by the rhythm of boots striking stone. Soldiers fanned out across the village square, barking orders in a language that cracked like ice. Julien stood beside his mother in the doorway, clutching her hand, watching as the world he knew bent beneath a shadow he couldn't yet name. The church bell stopped ringing. The bakery closed its shutters. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In a single afternoon, everything changed. Posters appeared on walls, their red ink shouting commands no one dared to disobey. Radios were confiscated, curfews announced. The cafe, once filled with music, now echoed only with silence and fear. German flags unfurled from balconies where flower boxes once hung. Julian's mother spoke little, her face tight as she sewed by candlelight, listening for footsteps outside. The neighbors whispered that the soldiers had taken over the school, turning the classrooms into barracks. The children were sent home, their books replaced by the sight of rifles slung over desks. Julian didn't understand what occupation meant, only that the adults now spoke in half-sentences and lowered voices. At night, the sky glowed faintly from distant fires. He would press his ear against the window and listen to the hum of engines passing through, wondering where they came from and when they would leave. But deep inside, he knew the answer. They wouldn't. Not soon. Weeks passed, and the village grew quieter. The Germans moved like ghosts through its streets, their boots always clean, their eyes always cold. The children no longer played near the churchyard. Instead, they gathered in corners, whispering stories about spies, battles, and brave men hiding in the woods. Julien listened wide-eyed, not realizing that soon he would become part of one of those stories. The soldiers seemed to notice everything, who lingered outside after dark, who traded whispers instead of words. One evening, a family from the next street disappeared without a trace. No one spoke of it, but everyone understood. The war had arrived not with explosions, but with silence, the kind that seeped into every room and stayed. Still, in that silence, Julien felt something stirring, a question he couldn't shake. Why were the men with guns afraid of whispers? It was the first thought of resistance, though he didn't yet know the word. It happened one grey afternoon, when rain fell softly over the rooftops and the world seemed muted by mist. Julien was walking home from the river, carrying a small bundle of firewood, when he heard voices coming from behind the old rectory wall. 2 German officers stood there, their coats gleaming wet, a map spread between them. They spoke quickly, the words sharp and clipped, but one phrase slipped through. Le pont, the bridge. Julien froze. The bridge was only a few miles away, the one road the villagers still used to trade for food. He crouched low, heart pounding, straining to listen as the men continued. Another voice joined them, the mayor's. His tone was trembling, apologetic. Julien didn't understand much, only fragments. Tonight, supplies, destroy. The boy pressed closer, breath shallow, until one of the soldiers turned suddenly. Julien darted away, mud splashing beneath his feet, the bundle of wood scattering behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached home, the echo of those words chasing him through the rain. That night, as wind battered the shutters, Julien couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the rhythmic tick of the old clock, replaying the conversation in his head. He didn't fully grasp what he'd heard, but he knew it was dangerous. The bridge was where the farmers crossed with milk and grain. If the soldiers meant to destroy it, people would starve. He turned toward his mother's room, wanting to tell her, but stopped. She was asleep, her face pale from exhaustion. On the wall above her hung a small crucifix and the faded photograph of his father, who had gone to the front and never returned. Julien stared at it for a long moment. He whispered softly, "Papa, what should I do?" Outside, thunder rolled across the hills like distant artillery. Something inside him, something small but fierce, whispered back, "Tell someone." It wasn't a command. It was a calling, quiet but unshakable. The next morning, Julien set out early, pretending to collect herbs near the forest's edge. The path was slick with mud, the trees heavy with mist. Deep among the trunks, he found what he was looking for, a hidden shelter built from fallen branches and earth. It was where the men of the village sometimes disappeared to at night, returning at dawn with soot on their faces and eyes full of secrets. When he reached the clearing, a tall figure stepped out from the shadows. Father Lucien, the village priest. His black cassock was damp, his hands rough from work that no sermon could explain. Julien's voice trembled as he spoke. "They're going to destroy the bridge, tonight." For a long time, the priest said nothing. He simply placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "Then we must stop them," he whispered. In that moment, Julien Morel's childhood ended, replaced by something larger, a quiet courage born not of strength, but of belief. The night came heavy with fog, cloaking the village in a silence, so thick it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. Julien crept through the alleys barefoot, a small figure wrapped in his father's old coat, the hem dragging across the cobblestones. In his pocket, folded twice and sealed with wax, was a message Father Lucien had written, a warning to the resistance fighters hidden near the river. "The bridge," the priest had said. "They plan to place charges before dawn." Julien nodded without a word. The priest's face was pale in the candlelight, his voice trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what he was asking. "They will not suspect a child," he said softly. And so the boy went, slipping between shadows, guided only by memory and moonlight. Every sound, a barking dog, a creaking shutter, made his heart jump. The Germans had set up checkpoints near the square, and their flashlights cut through the mist like blades. He waited until one turned away, then darted into the dark. The path to the river wound, through the old orchard, where the apple trees stood like ghosts. Julien moved low, his breath clouding in the cold air. The bridge loomed ahead, its stone arch vanishing into the fog. On the far side, he could just make out the faint outline of soldiers, 2 of them, rifles slung, pacing the road. He hid behind a cart, his small fingers gripping the message so tightly it wrinkled. A gust of wind carried the faint sound of their voices, the clink of metal against stone. He waited for the right moment, then slipped down toward the embankment, his feet sinking into the wet earth. Beneath the bridge, the world was muffled. Only the steady drip of water, the rush of the current, and the thud of his heartbeat in his chest. He crawled through the reeds until he saw them, 2 men crouched near a lantern, their faces gaunt but alive with purpose. The resistance. One of them, a young man with a torn jacket, turned sharply. "Who are you?" Julien lifted the paper, his hands shaking. "From Father Lucien," he whispered. For a moment no one spoke. Then the man snatched the note, broke the seal, and read by the dim light. His eyes widened. "Mon Dieu," he muttered. "They're coming at dawn." He looked at the boy, astonished. "You crossed the patrols alone?" Julien nodded. The man exhaled, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "You've done more than most grown men would dare." They doused the lantern immediately, and within seconds the camp came alive. Men, gathering rifles, pulling on coats, checking the lines of explosives already hidden beneath the planks. "Go home, little one," the man said, "and tell the priest we'll be ready." But Julien didn't move. He stood there, shivering, his bare feet soaked in mud, watching as the men vanished into the mist. In that instant, he understood the gravity of what he'd done. He wasn't playing anymore. He was part of the war now, a whisper in the dark, carrying the weight of a secret that could change everything. The next morning, the village awoke to the sound of thunder that wasn't from the sky. The bridge exploded at dawn, a flash of orange fire blooming against the grey mist, followed by the echoing roar that rolled across the valley like the anger of the gods. Julien watched from his window as birds scattered into the air, their wings cutting through the smoke that curled above the river. His mother ran to him, pulling him away from the glass, whispering prayers under her breath. "Stay inside," she said. But he couldn't stop listening. Beneath the noise, he could hear shouts in German, orders barked, boots pounding, trucks roaring down the road. The occupation that had once felt distant was now alive and furious. By noon, the soldiers had locked down the village. They questioned everyone, even the children, searching for anyone who might know who had sabotaged their work. Julien said nothing. He sat at the table, pretending to study his schoolbook. While his heart thudded so loud, he thought they could hear it through the walls. Outside, the world had changed colors. The wheat fields where he once played now seemed grey, lifeless under the shadow of patrols. Soldiers marched past the bakery, rifles glinting, faces hard. The villagers avoided eye contact, their fear now something visible, shared. Julien noticed everything. The trembling hands of the butcher when a German officer spoke to him, the way the priest's sermons grew, shorter, quieter. He began to understand things children shouldn't have to, what a whisper meant, what a glance could betray, what silence could save. One evening, he walked to the hill behind the house and saw the black smoke still rising from the bridge's ruins. He remembered the way it used to shimmer in the sunlight, how he'd skipped stones beneath it. Now it was gone, and yet the river still flowed, as if nothing had happened. To him, that seemed strange and beautiful, that the world could keep moving even when people could not. As the days passed, Julien carried on as if nothing had changed, but everything had. He delivered bread to the church, water to the soldiers, listening quietly as they talked among themselves. He learned the rhythm of their patrols, their habits, their fears. The soldiers saw only a boy with messy hair and dirt on his hands. None of them imagined that same boy had crossed under their watch and helped destroy their bridge. The war was becoming a puzzle he could read through the smallest clues, the way an officer folded a map, the direction of passing trucks, the tone of a shouted order. And yet, amidst the chaos, he still found fragments of his childhood lingering. The taste of jam on bread, the smell of hay in summer, the quiet moments when he would hum to himself, pretending the world beyond the barbed wire was still kind. It was through those moments of fragile peace that Julien saw the war for what it truly was, not just a fight between armies, but a storm that turned innocence into memory. It happened on a morning that smelled of rain and smoke. The Germans had gathered the entire village in the square. Soldiers stood in a line, rifles gleaming under the weak sun, their boots sinking into the mud. Julien clung to his mother's coat, his breath short, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. In the center of the square stood Father Lucien, hands bound, his face bruised but unbroken. An officer shouted in German, waving a piece of paper, the same message Julien had carried beneath his coat. The boy froze. His stomach twisted as he realized what it was. Someone had betrayed them. The soldiers accused the priest of aiding saboteurs. The crowd stood in silence, no one daring to speak. Julien wanted to scream, to tell them it was his fault, that it wasn't the priest who had crossed the patrols that night, but his mother's hand tightened on his shoulder, and he understood the meaning of that silence. It was protection, sacrifice, and sorrow all at once. The soldiers dragged the priest away. The villagers bowed their heads, and the rain began to fall. That night, the church bell rang once, a sound that echoed through the valley like a wound. The Germans called it justice. The villagers called it a warning. Julien sat by the window, staring into the darkness, unable to cry. He felt something inside him break, not loudly but quietly, like a flame snuffed out by wind. His mother tried to comfort him, whispering prayers, but the words no longer reached him. The boy who once played with sticks and dreamed of knights now understood what real courage looked like, and how much it cost. The next morning, he walked to the edge of the woods where he had last seen Father Lucien. The mud still bore the deep grooves of boots. He knelt down and pressed his hand against the cold earth. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and gunpowder. Somewhere far away, he thought he heard the priest's voice, calm as ever. Do not let fear be the last thing you feel. From that day on, Julien changed. He stopped playing, stopped laughing. Even the other children noticed, calling him the quiet one. But silence had become his shield. He began to help the older villagers secretly, delivering notes, watching for patrols, hiding bread for men in the forest. No one told him what to do. He simply moved as if guided by something invisible, something the war itself had awakened. Every step he took, every secret he kept, felt like a promise to the priest who had believed in him. He was no longer the boy who watched trains and dreamed of faraway places. He was something smaller, yet greater, a child carrying the weight of a man's burden. And though the war had taken his innocence, it had given him something the soldiers could never understand. Purpose. Winter came early that year, sweeping across the valley with a pale, merciless cold. The fields turned white, the river froze, and the village seemed to vanish beneath a blanket of silence. Food was scarce, and so was warmth. Yet in that season of hunger, Julien met the man who would change everything. It happened near the ruins of the bridge. He had gone there alone, as he often did, to leave a bundle of bread beneath the stones for the partisans who still hid in the hills. But this time, as he crouched to set it down, a voice spoke from behind him, rough, foreign, yet strangely gentle. "You're a brave one to come this far alone." Julien spun around. Standing a few paces away was a soldier, not German but American, his uniform torn, his face smeared with dirt. He was young, barely more than a boy himself, his breath fogging in the cold. A downed pilot, maybe. His arm was bandaged with a strip of cloth, and his eyes were filled with exhaustion and relief. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two strangers bound by the same danger. Then Julien reached into his coat and offered what little he had left, half a piece of bread. The soldier smiled faintly, accepting it with trembling hands. "Merci," he whispered in broken French. Julien didn't know English, but he understood gratitude when he saw it. The man pointed toward the hills and said softly, "Friends, there?" Julien nodded, gesturing toward the forest's edge. The soldier winced as he stood, leaning on a fallen branch like a crutch. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice weaker now. Julien looked up at him and replied in the simplest words he knew. "Neither should you." It made the soldier laugh. A quiet, weary sound that somehow felt like sunlight in winter. Together, they crossed the frozen path, moving through the woods toward a small stone hut where the resistance sometimes hid. Julien guided him with the instinct of someone who had long since stopped being afraid. When they reached the door, he knocked 3 times, the signal Father Lucien had once taught him. The door opened, revealing 2 men in worn coats, their rifles raised until they saw the pilot. "An American," one whispered. "How in God's name?" They pulled him inside, wrapping him in blankets, thanking the boy over and over. Julien stood in the doorway, snow clinging to his hair, watching as the soldier ate and smiled weakly. Before leaving, one of the partisans knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more for France today than most grown men," he said quietly. Julien didn't answer. He simply nodded, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the fire. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. And in that fleeting moment, amid the cold, the hunger, the silence, hope returned to the boy who thought he had forgotten what it felt like to save someone. By spring, the air smelled of thawed earth and smoke. The Germans were retreating slowly, like a wounded beast refusing to die, and the valley had become a corridor of whispers. Rumors said the Allies were near, but no one dared to believe it aloud. Julien had grown taller, thinner, his face sharper, older than his 9 years. The resistance trusted him now, not as a boy, but as their smallest courier, the one who could slip past checkpoints without suspicion. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, a man arrived at the church ruins where they met in secret. He carried a folded map, damp from the rain. "The Germans plan to burn the village," he said. "They think the Americans are hiding here." A murmur spread through the group. Julien stood silent until one of the men turned to him. "We need to get this to the radio post in the next town. It's 10 kilometers through patrol lines." No one volunteered. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of a broken clock on the wall. Then Julien stepped forward. "I can do it." The men protested. He was just a child, but he looked at them steadily, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "They won't stop me. They never look at children." Before dawn, he set out with the map hidden inside his boot. The fields were wet with dew, the sky bruised with the promise of rain. He moved like a shadow through the hedgerows, past the burned-out barns and silent houses. In the distance, he could hear the hum of engines and the low growl of voices. Twice he froze as soldiers passed within meters, their cigarettes glowing in the dark. He waited until the embers faded, then crawled through the mud toward the main road. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the checkpoint, his heart pounded so loud he thought it would give him away. A German guard stood by the gate, yawning, his rifle slung over one shoulder. Julien carried a basket of eggs, the perfect disguise. "Wo gehst du?" the soldier asked lazily. "To the farm," Julien answered in practiced German, his accent soft, innocent. The guard smirked and waved him through. He didn't even notice the boy's trembling hands. Julien didn't stop until he reached the outskirts of the next town, where a barn roof stood half-collapsed against the horizon. Inside, beneath a pile of hay, the resistance had hidden their radio. He handed the map to the operator, a woman with soot-streaked cheeks and tired eyes. She read it once, then twice, her face tightening. "This will save lives," she whispered. Before Julien could reply, the distant whine of engines filled the air. Planes, Allied ones this time. The woman grabbed the transmitter, calling in coordinates. Moments later, thunder rolled from the skies as bombs rained down on the German convoys retreating through the valley. Julien watched through a crack in the barn wall as columns of smoke rose into the heavens. His knees trembled, not from fear, but from awe. He had done it. The boy who once hid from soldiers had delivered a blow that changed the tide of war in his little corner of the world. As he walked back toward the village under the burning sky, he realized something profound. Courage wasn't born from strength, it was born from love. The morning after the bombing, Saint-Denis-sur-Meuse was unrecognizable. Smoke still curled from the fields, and the air hung heavy with the scent of ash and gunpowder. The German trucks were gone, scattered wrecks along the road, their blackened metal twisted into strange shapes against the pale sky. Julien walked among the ruins in silence, his boots crunching over fragments of glass and charred wood. The village was free, or at least what remained of it. The people emerged slowly from their homes, faces grey with soot and disbelief, as if waking from a nightmare they weren't sure had truly ended. The church was little more than a shell now, its bell fallen, its steeple broken, but the sound of weeping came from within, prayers of both grief and gratitude tangled in the same breath. Julien stood in the doorway, watching his mother kneel before the altar, her hands trembling as she whispered his name in thanks. For the first time in years, the fear that had lived behind her eyes was gone. The resistance fighters returned by noon, moving carefully through the wreckage, helping the wounded, searching for those lost in the chaos. One of them, the same man who had once taken Julien's first message, found him near the well. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice low and rough. "You did this," he said. "Without you, none of us would be here." Julien didn't answer. He looked at the sky, at the distant trail of smoke that marked where the last German column had vanished, and felt no triumph, only an immense, aching quiet. The kind of silence that comes after thunder, too deep for celebration. Around him, life began to stir again. Women carrying water, men clearing rubble, children peeking from behind broken fences. The war had left its mark, but so had courage. It wasn't victory that filled the air, but survival. A fragile, beautiful kind of peace, the kind that trembles before it stands. That night, the village gathered around a single fire in the square. The flames flickered against the faces of the living and cast soft light on the names of the lost. Someone began to sing, an old lullaby. And slowly, others joined in, their voices thin but steady. Julien sat beside his mother, her arm around him, his eyes reflecting the orange glow. He thought of Father Lucien, of the bridge, of the soldier in the snow, and of the sky that had burned red over the valley. The war had taken so much laughter, faith, childhood, but in its ruin it had revealed something unbreakable. As the song faded, only the crackle of the fire remained, mingling with the sigh of the wind. For the first time, Julien allowed himself to close his eyes, not to forget, but to rest. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the sound of a world learning to breathe again. In the weeks that followed, word spread like wind through the valleys. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, Paris was free, and Germany was collapsing under its own weight. The soldiers who once marched through Saint-Denis-sur-Meuse were gone, replaced by the distant roar of American convoys heading east. The war, which had once seemed endless, was finally dying. Yet as peace crept back into Europe, it revealed the true scale of the devastation. The boy walked the roads where fields had turned to graveyards and villages lay in dust. Burned barns, hollow homes, rail tracks twisted by bombs, reminders that victory was never clean. For every banner of liberation that fluttered, there were faces that would never return to see it. Historians would later call it the cost of freedom. For Julien, it was simply what remained after the noise stopped, a quiet too large to fill. But amid the ruins, the resilience of life began to bloom again. The villagers rebuilt their roofs with salvaged wood, planted seeds in blackened soil, and repaired the bridge stone by stone, as if defying the memory of its destruction. Across France, thousands of stories like Julien's were whispered but rarely written. Children turned couriers, messengers and spies, invisible threads in the vast tapestry of the resistance. They carried notes in their shoes, smuggled food through checkpoints, and risked everything for a cause they barely understood. History would remember generals and battles, but seldom the small hands that tipped the scales. The Allies, upon entering liberated villages, found these young faces among the rubble, too thin, too quiet, but with eyes that held the weight of men twice their age. Some were honored after the war, most simply returned to their lives, their deeds unspoken, their courage buried beneath time. Julien was one of them. His name would never appear in newspapers or memorials. Yet, in that forgotten village by the river, the story of the boy who carried messages beneath his coat would be told in whispers around fires for generations, a legend not of war, but of heart. Historians later confirmed what Father Lucien had died protecting. The resistance networks across northern France had used children as silent couriers, an act born not of cruelty, but necessity. They were invisible to suspicion, able to slip through the cracks of an occupied world. Some called them angels of the shadows, others the smallest soldiers. Julien's story was one among thousands, yet it carried the same truth, that war was not only fought with weapons, but with will. And in that struggle, innocence became both shield and sword. When the Allied forces finally entered Saint-Denis-sur-Meuse, They found no soldiers, no fortifications, only villagers waving from the ruins, and a young boy standing beside the rebuilt bridge. He didn't salute or cheer. He just watched quietly as the tanks rolled past, their stars painted white against the dust. To him, the war had ended long before that day, the moment he chose to act when no one else could. Decades later, the river still flowed beneath the rebuilt bridge, clear and calm, as if it had forgotten the flames that once touched its surface. The village of Andim, Saint-Denis-sur-Meuse, had grown again. New houses, new laughter, new generations who played where tanks once rolled. But for Julien Morel, now an old man with silver hair and a walking cane, the ghosts had never left. He returned each spring to that same hill where he once watched trains, the view unchanged except for the silence it held. The world had moved on, the war reduced to black and white photographs in history books, its sounds replaced by television static and the hum of cars on distant roads. Yet when he closed his eyes, Julien could still hear the voices of those days, his mother's prayers, the sharp orders of soldiers, the priest's whisper. Then we must stop them. They came back, not as pain, but as echoes of a life that had shaped him before he even understood what courage was. He often walked to the old church, rebuilt from stone and memory, its bell restored to the tower. Inside, the light fell through stained glass in colors of blood and gold. On the far wall hung a bronze plaque etched with names, farmers, teachers, mothers, and one simply marked Père Lucien. Beneath it, flowers were always placed, though no one ever said by whom. Julien would stand before it, hat in hand, tracing the engraved letters with the same fingers that once carried secret messages through the dark. He never spoke of what he did. He had learned that true bravery rarely announces itself. When children from the village asked him about the war, he would smile faintly and say it was a time when silence could save lives. Only when they ran off to play would his expression change, softening with the weight of memory, his gaze drifting to the sky as if searching for the fireflies that once lit his childhood nights. In his final years, Julien lived quietly in a small house by the river. He kept few possessions, a worn photograph of his mother, a faded map folded into his Bible, and a tin soldier missing one arm. Sometimes he would sit by the window, watching the sun melt into the water, and think of all the lives intertwined with his. The priest, the American pilot, the nameless men who had trusted him with their lives. He knew that the world would never truly understand what it meant to be 9 years old and hold history in your hands, but he didn't need it to. He had lived long enough to see the village free, to hear laughter where once there was fear. And in the quiet rhythm of the river he found peace, not the kind given by time, but the kind earned through survival. In the end, Julien's story became more than memory. It became a lesson, not about war, but about what endures when war tries to erase everything human. On the anniversary of liberation, the villagers gathered by the bridge, now adorned with flowers and small flags fluttering in the breeze. Children ran along the riverbank, laughing, unaware that beneath their feet the earth still carried the bones of a darker time. Julien, frail but standing tall, watched them from his chair near the water's edge. His eyes, though dimmed by age, still held the same quiet fire they had the day he first crossed the patrol lines with a message hidden in his pocket. When the mayor began to speak, recounting the names of those who had fallen, the crowd fell silent. But when he reached the name of Father Lucien, the bell tolled once, deep, solemn, and final. Julien closed his eyes, feeling the vibration in his chest, and whispered a prayer for the man who had once believed a child could make a difference. As the ceremony ended, a young girl approached him. Perhaps 9 years old, the same age he had been when history first touched him. She held out a small bouquet of daisies. "My papa says you were a hero," she said shyly. Julien smiled, shaking his head. "No, little one, I was just a messenger." The girl looked confused. "But isn't that what heroes do?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took the flowers and placed them on the stone engraved with the names of the lost. The river shimmered behind him, carrying the reflection of the bridge, strong, rebuilt, eternal. He thought of all the children across Europe who had carried secrets in their shoes, who had risked everything without ever understanding the word bravery. Their stories were scattered like petals in the wind, unseen but never gone. When the sun began to set, casting gold across the valley, Julien rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and took one last look at the water. The current moved steadily, indifferent yet eternal, just as it had when he was a boy. He smiled faintly and whispered to the wind. He was too young to fight, but old enough to teach the world what courage means. The wind carried the words downstream, over the stones of the bridge, and into the open fields beyond, where freedom had once been only a dream. And as the light faded, the village bells rang again, not for mourning, but for remembrance. A reminder that even in the darkest hours of history, it was often the smallest hands that held the greatest strength.